Hey, how's it going? And welcome to part 5. And in this part, we're going to be creating the idle looping animations. And these are basically the breathing animations, I guess you could call them, just when the character is standing still and idling, pretty much. And we're going to be creating two versions of this. So one for the base idle pose, and then also one for the aimed version. So let's just jump into it. So first off, I want to duplicate the idle pose. Like this. And I'm just going to rename this one to idle loop. And also make sure to save it. And I want to set the end frame here to 60. Because I want the animation to be 60 frames. It doesn't have to be 60, but in this case, as an example, I'm going to use 60. So you can use whatever value that looks good to you. So let's switch into pose mode here so we can select the bones. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to copy the entire keyframe set here for the gun by selecting the top one. And then I'm going to press Shift D and move it to the end here, to the last frame. And then I'm going to start with like the up and down motion, just to get like a base, some base stuff going here. So I'm going to copy the Z keyframe and place it halfway at 30. Then I'm going to go into the graph editor. I usually start working immediately in the graph editor for the looping animations because it feels a bit easier to me. But if you want, you can also start animating visually by moving it like this. And then I'm just going to select this half point keyframe, and I'm going to move it down by pressing GY. And we can already see that it's starting to move here on the screen as well. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And now if we play it by pressing space, we can see that the gun is moving up and down. Got some basic breathing going on here. Maybe a bit too much, so I'm going to tone that down a little bit. And that's the final animation. It's finished. No, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna be adding some more detail to it by, just adding like some rotation and maybe some side-to-side movement just to make it look a bit more interesting. So I'm also going to copy the X location here and focus on it by double-clicking on it and pressing the delete key on numpad. Not the normal delete key. We don't want to delete anything, so just make sure it's the numpad and not the normal one. And then I'm going to place out a few more of these just to basically just try some different combinations here to see what it will look like. We can also move it up a little bit if we wanted to move a bit different. And at this point, you can really just kind of try your way and get the results you want, because there's really no rules for this. I mean, it's completely up to your own interpretation. And if we want to move this, let's say we want to kind of offset this a little bit, we have an issue where the animation ends here, so it's going to basically stop animating at this point. But what we can do here is select the entire curve by double-clicking and then pressing Shift E and choosing Make Cyclic. And this will basically generate like an infinite loop for this curve. So even if you only have like 4 or 5 keyframes placed out, you can still offset it without having any pauses in the animation. And we can preview it in the window here and see how it looks. And adding that X movement really gives it a bit more of a natural feeling, I think. And we can do that for the Y-axis as well. So placing out some more keyframes for that. And making it cyclic. And I'm just going to move these slightly. And also move these up a little bit. And that seems a bit intense. I'm just going to turn that down a little bit. And also give it some slight offset here. And maybe even less intense. And that just gives us like a bit of some random motion. It looks a bit more dynamic. Kind of fine-tuning the up and down motion. And what we can do next is add some rotation to it. So I'm going to start with some X rotation. So it will be on this axis here. And I'm going to do the same process here. I'm going to copy the X rotation keyframe and place it halfway through. And then just focus in on the curve here. And zoom out a little bit and give it some rotation. That's a bit too much. And I'm also going to make this one cyclic. And to make it feel less like robotic, we can move these, like offset them a little bit. And we can also try by maybe scaling them down halfway by pressing S, X 0.5. So this will speed it up by 2. Then you can just play around with the offset here to get some results that you think looks good. I think this is pretty good. It's like a subtle rotation. And if you want, you can also do this for the other rotations. So I'm gonna copy the Y axis and do the same thing. And I usually try to keep these rotations pretty minimal, because it can feel a bit too much if you make them really intense, it can feel a bit awkward in the game later on. And also doing this for the Z axis. And this one I'm going to try to keep very minimal, so it doesn't interrupt too much with the aim. Like you basically want to mostly keep the gun pointed forward. You don't want it to go too much side to side. And I think that's pretty good. It's a solid base. We can always come back and change it later. So it's not the final result by any means. You can always tweak it. And finally, what I usually like to do is add some slight camera movement as well. And this can really help with the feel of the animation. So some slight breathing, maybe some side to side, or rotation. So I'm just going to use the same method here. Copy the initial keyframes and place them at the last frame. And then I'm going to copy the Z keyframe, place it halfway through. And then just start moving it down a little bit. And when it comes to camera animation, it's important to keep it very subtle. Because it can, if it's too large movements, it can cause motion sickness. It can feel annoying, when you're playing the game. I know a lot of people don't really like camera animation by default. So if you do use it, you should keep it to a minimum. Something like that, just like some slight movement. And you can use these reference cubes here in the background to get a better feel for the motion. You can also look at the grid on the ground here to see how much is moving. Might actually be a bit too much. I'm going to tone it down even more. And we can also offset this a little bit so it's not like perfectly in sync with the weapon. And I think this is pretty good. And that's our finished idle loop. And now that we're happy with this one, it's time to create the aimed version of this. And there's a few different ways you can do this. My usual process involves using an add-on called Animation Layers, which I'm not going to be covering in this tutorial because I wanted to keep it as basic as possible and only use the built-in functions. But if you're interested, I'm going to put a link to that in the description and you can check it out. And if there's enough interest, maybe I'll make another tutorial on that in the future, who knows. But for now, we're going to be using a more, basic approach to this, a bit more manual work required, but it's okay. It's not too bad. So to make the aimed version, I'm going to duplicate this one by pressing here. And I'm going to call this one idle loop _ aimed. And then I'm going to go to our aim pose. And I'm going to select everything by pressing A. And then copy it by pressing Ctrl C. So copying this entire pose. And then I'm going to go back to our idle loop aimed. And I'm just going to scroll all the way back here on the timeline. So it's outside of this animated section. And I'm going to paste everything in by pressing Ctrl V. Oh, by the way, if it doesn't paste everything, you have to select one of the bones like this, and then it will work. Okay. And now we can see that there's some awkward issues going on, which is fine. We'll fix that. But basically what's happening is that the looping is now broken because there's very different keys here at the end. So as we can see, all the curves are a bit messed up at the moment. So to fix that, I'm going to start by moving each of these keyframes from the aimed pose and just kind of moving them to the last keyframe of the idle, the normal idle pose here. So basically I'm just replacing the ones we made earlier with the aimed location. And we can also delete the ones for the camera because the camera settings are the same, so we don't have to do anything with that. So select the camera keyframes and press delete, X and delete. And now we can see that it's still messed up. So let's go into the gun keyframes here, and we can see that the aimed keyframe from the aim pose, which is this one, it's much higher than the ones we had before. So we have to basically match these keyframes to this aimed location. And what we can do is we can copy this one and place it on the first, like so. And then all we have to do is match these ones to this new location. So to do that, you can just select them and then move them up. Like that. And now we can see that the X location is fine, but everything else is messed up. So I'm just gonna keep repeating this process for everything. So just copying this last keyframe here for every single bone or every single axis. And for the Y rotation, we can actually delete this one because for the aim pose, I'm not gonna rotate it on the Y axis. So I'm gonna delete this one. And finally do this for the Z as well. And now if we play it, we can actually see that the gun is fine. But we do have some issues with the arm kind of slowly moving into a new position here. And that's because in the aim pose, we actually moved this arm into this position instead of this one. And to fix that, we can actually select all of the aim pose keyframes here at the end. So we can select them all by Alt right-clicking. And that's going to select everything in this on this one keyframe. And we can move them and replace the first ones. And that's going to fix the issue. And just remember to not replace any of the gun bones or the camera bones or camera keyframes, because then it's going to break it, basically. So now we can check it out here. And it looks pretty good, but there's some, it feels a bit awkward with the rotation here, like the side is getting covered by the backside here. So to fix that, I'm gonna, first of all, tone down the up and down motion here. So make it a bit less intense. And I'm also going to tone down the rotation by quite a bit. So just scaling these down on the y-axis. And we can still see that it's moving around quite a bit. And I think that's because of the X location. So I'm just gonna, first of all, I'm gonna move the centered pose here up slightly. And then I'm gonna scale it all down. And now we can see that it's much more stable, and you can actually aim and also see everything properly. And I'm also gonna move the Z up a little bit. And also tone it down even more, I think. And that's pretty good, because I usually like to keep the aim idle loop a bit more subtle, because it can feel very annoying when you're trying to aim and the gun is just like swinging around all over the place. So it does help to keep it subtle. And for the camera animation, I think this is fine. We might want to tone it down even a bit more. And we can do that by just selecting the camera controller here and moving these keys up a little bit. And I think that's pretty good. So now we have two versions. We have the aimed version and we have the default one. And if you're happy with both versions, we can go ahead and export them. So to export them, it's the same process as we did in the last video. So switching to object mode and selecting the character brig. And then I'm just gonna copy this name here. So copy the animation name and then going to File, Export, FBX. And we're gonna be using the same settings as before as well. So selected objects, armature, and bake animation. And also only deform bones. It's very important that we select this one. And I'm gonna call this one the idle loop aimed that we copied, and then export. And do the same for the idle loop default one. Just copying the name, file, export, and paste it in, and export. All right, and that's it for the exporting and creation of the idle loops. Something that we can also do is place a marker at the end of this animation here. And the reason for this is because when we eventually create more animations, it can get a bit confusing to remember the end frames of each animation. Because when we're exporting the animations, we need to manually enter the end frame here. Otherwise, it's basically going to export the whole thing. And specifically for these idle loop animations, we only want to export this section right here. We don't want to export any of these other keyframes because these are not part of the loop. So we just want to export 0 to 60. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to frame 60 and press M to add a new marker. And then I'm going to rename it by hovering over it and pressing F2. And I'm going to call this one end idle loop. And that's just a little reminder. It doesn't actually affect anything, but it's like a reminder of the timeline range for this specific animation. All right, that's it for this video. And in the next one, we're going to create the movement animations. And that includes the walk. We're also going to be making an aimed walk, and we're also going to be making a run animation. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.